Good morning, aloha. Let's go ahead and get started. I think it's okay if I'm down here. You can see me in the back and everything. I don't want to be way up there above all of you. Again, good to have all of you here. I'm Congressman Ed Case. I represent the 1st Congressional District of Hawaii, which is the city of Honolulu proper. My district is Makapu'u to Ko'olina to Mililani. Everything else on Oahu and the neighbor islands is Jill Takuda at this point, my new teammate, but we don't care about that. District lines have never meant a whole bunch to the Hawaii Congressional Delegation, so we all work together, coordinate a lot of stuff. I want to introduce my staff who is here with me today. From Washington, D.C., I have Tim Nelson, my Chief of Staff up there. I've also got Kanan Miranda, who is right here. Kanan is your best contact on federal funding because he runs all my appropriations stuff. Deputy Chief of Staff Jackie Conant runs things here in Hawaii for me, and she's the easiest way into my office for anything, so that's who you should go to. Nestor Garcia, my communications director and my former colleague in the U.S., I'm sorry, not the U.S. He did try that once, by the way, but it didn't work out. In the state legislature, and Kira Empting, who is with my office here in Honolulu, and then I have Major Lauren Cooper back there, who is my defense fellow. Every year I have somebody from the military in my year for the year, so that they can get some experience and I get some good staff. So any of these people are available to help you, and we're all happy to be here with you a little bit. I especially want to welcome my colleagues in state and county government here. All of you, you're very appreciated for being here, especially Speaker Emeritus Say over there, who I've had many battles with over the years. We'll all write about it in our book someday if we remember it all. I want to forget most of it, by the way. Federal funding. Critical to our state, billions of dollars per year. What is it all about, and how do we get it? That's the subject of this morning's discussion. I do this once every 2 years because number one, federal funding is critical to our state in many, many areas. But number two, I don't think we do a good enough job of getting it. And so my purpose here is to give you an overview. You will probably leave here with more questions than answers. But that's fine because the last slide is how to get in touch with us on questions and answers. So this is going to be kind of 101. It's a little cluttered. It's a big topic. I'm going to try to summarize it, and then at the end we'll do some questions for a little while, and then we'll leave it to you to kind of chew on it and then follow up with us. And by the way, again, it's a congressional delegation. It's a 4-person team. We all coordinate with each other especially on the appropriations site. And we're really, really well equipped from this perspective because especially both Senator Schatz and I are on our corresponding appropriations committees. And so this is the time to use this. And Senator Hirono, especially on armed services and some of the other defense and also the human services related stuff. And then Congresswoman Takuda has ended up with some very good committee assignments as well in agriculture and armed services. But this is a team effort. We're a small delegation, 4 out of 535, so we have to work together. So here's my agenda. I'm going to just do a really brief overview of federal finances in general. I'm going to talk about the congressional appropriations process. I'm going to talk about where we are right now in fiscal year 2024 or getting ready for it. I'm then going to go down to how to ask for appropriations requests. I'm going to invert the last two. How you should work with us to get money for Hawaii. And then finally, I'm going to talk about 2 landmark, once-in-a-generation opportunities for us here in Hawaii that if we don't take full advantage of this, it's our problem, not anybody else's. And so this is one of the top issues in my office right now, is to make sure that these 2 bills which have the potential to bring billions of dollars to Hawaii for a lot of the needs that we have, are fully taken advantage of. So let's start with Federal Finances 101. A couple of real basic things that need to be said up front. First of all, we operate on a fiscal year that starts on October 1st of every year. So we think in terms of fiscal years, as does the state and county, by the way. So this isn't rocket science, but that's what we do. And we are currently in the middle of fiscal year 2023, which started on October 1st of 2022 and runs to September 30th of 2023. This timeline is set to give us time to get through a budget every year. So the timelines I'm talking about are working backwards from September 30th of this year. Because in theory, if we were doing everything correctly, and that's the second part of this, which is we haven't been doing them correctly, but if we were doing everything correctly, we would pass all of our appropriations bills for the following year by September 30th. Because otherwise the federal government doesn't have authority to spend money in that fiscal year. Now, you know as well as I do that we've been messing this up in the last several years, and we get into things called continuing resolutions, which take us into the following fiscal year, even though we haven't finished our work, just to keep the government running. But this is what we aspire to do in a normal budget cycle. Okay, this is a little busy, but what it basically says is that our federal budget, in theory, is really no different from a personal budget, from a business budget, or from many state and county government budgets. We have revenues right up here, revenues, taxes, fees, everything else. We have expenses, which are, and these are from FY 2022, and I'm going to be jumping around among fiscal years because we don't always have consistent information completed from fiscal year to fiscal year. But don't worry about the figures. These are just concepts to get you started. And by the way, I'm going to circulate this, make this available to everybody, so you don't have to take a lot of notes and stuff. But in 2022, we collected $4.9 trillion, and we spent $6.27 trillion. This is one of the biggest differences between the state and county budgets and the federal budget, which is in the federal government, we can borrow money to make up our difference. As you know, our Constitution here in the state of Hawaii says you got to balance your budget. I almost wish we had that in the federal government. We can borrow money. How do we borrow money? We issue bonds and other financing mechanisms that allow us to make up deficits, which a deficit being the difference in any fiscal year between expenses and revenues to handle that extra expense. And so in 2022, we had a deficit, a one-year deficit of the difference between these two. And deficits add up to debt over time. And so each deficit every year, if you don't make it up the following year, then you're accumulating debt. Now the federal government does run on a debt, some reasonable debt basis, just as most personal and businesses do. You usually have an acceptable level of debt. However, and this is me editorializing, but it ain't no secret, we're way out of whack in terms of our particular debt. We're closing in on about $31 trillion of federal debt. Now, I'll get to a slide later on that talks a little bit about the implications of that. So basically, pretty straightforward. Now, when we talk in the federal budget, and this is again no different really from state and county government budgets, we have to distinguish between two types of spending. The first we call mandatory spending. And mandatory spending is spending that's just kind of on autopilot. It's automatic, it goes on from year to year, it's an obligation, it's not going to be cut off. We don't have to operate on it every year to appropriate it. It goes out because it's really reliant upon revenues, independent revenues coming in and expenses going out. And the classic example of this is Social Security. I don't appropriate Social Security benefits every year. It's mandatory, it's required, it is non-discretionary, and it's going to happen. The discretionary spending is what I deal in every single year. This is most of the operational aspects of the federal government, in fact, all of them, virtually all of them. And this is discretionary spending that is not appropriated on a 10-year cycle. It needs to be done every single year. It's not automatic that it's going to be spent. In practice, most of the time, yes, of course, we will continue to fund this particular welfare program. But it's not something that is just a given. So this is where the world that I deal in. And the discretionary spend, you can see over here that far more of our total federal government spending is mandatory than is discretionary. This runs about 75-25 versus 71-27, depending on the year. But anyway, a lot of our spending is mandatory, and the mandatory amount is increasing relative to discretionary, which causes us additional concern about our federal government, because if that kind of overtakes you and you're running a lot of debt, then you lose track and control of your finances. So I just want to note the mandatory, but I'm going to focus on discretionary because that's where I really play. This is a quick breakdown of total federal spending so that you can kind of see that a little bit more directly. Mandatory up here at about 71% in this particular fiscal year. Discretionary is over here. And we will get to this, but of our discretionary spending, you can see that roughly a half is defense related in some way or another, and roughly a half is everything else. Also interest, which is starting to overwhelm our federal budgets because we're borrowing so much, and we have to pay interest. We have to pay interest on those borrowings. So like any business, any government, any personal thing, if you've got too much debt, too much interest, it starts to overwhelm your finances. But we can never forget about interest. This is a little too tight, but it basically says interest matters. If you take a look at interest costs relative to spending on other programs, you can see that net interest down here is starting to outpace many of our programs in terms of federal spending. Thus the concern about debt and deficits in the debate in Washington right now. This is a little bit more about debt. I just want to make sure that we all understand that federal finances are not something that are just automatic and go on and you don't have to worry about them. This is our debt, aggregate debt over time. This is 2022. This is World War II. And you can see that we're just on an upward spiral right now. We've kind of lost control of it in some ways. Now, in fairness, a lot of this was COVID, because all of the COVID monies that you're dealing with at the state and county government levels and otherwise right now, almost all of that was borrowed. In fact, all of it was borrowed. It was not financed out of normal revenues. It was a one-time emergency borrowing to the tune of about $6 trillion. So if you want to think about debt, back here just a couple of years ago, it was at somewhere around 20 trillion, 21, 22 when I got into Congress just 4 years ago. And then we had some very difficult years of COVID, and we borrowed somewhere in the range of $6 to $7 trillion. So that has accelerated our problem. This chart talks about debt to GDP, which is one measure of how much of a problem you are in from a debt perspective. So that basically says, is the amount of money coming into your economy sufficient to handle your debt? And if it's not, then your debt starts to drag down your economy. We're at one of the high points. In fact, we are at a high point right now in debt to GDP. That means that our total debt is more than the total output of our economy. And that's scary. FY 2023 federal discretionary spending, let's focus in now on the discretionary side that we all care about particularly right now. Total 1.3, this is for the last fiscal year that we just finished. You can see over here of that 1.7, defense has 44%, and you might not be able to read it, it's so small, so I'll just point out some of these. The next largest ones are usually labor, health, and human services, which is all of our social services. At 12%, we've got commerce, justice, and science. This is really our business and law enforcement and science-related efforts at 5%. Up there is military construction, which is technically defense-related, right? But VA has a lot of that. So Veterans Administration has 18%. But you can see that some of the others that we think are particularly important to us and our country are pretty small, like interior and environment. Our protection of our environment, 2% of the total federal budget. And this is not unlike the state of Hawaii, of course, where DLNR is substantially underfunded. But the point here is 1.7 trillion, we're really allocating about half of that to defense and about half of that to everything else. Now that's a pro and a con. Some people say that's too much to put to defense. And the other side of that is we have to defend our country, and incidentally, Hawaii has a major role in the defense of our country. Thus, defense spending comes disproportionately to Hawaii and helps our economy. Defense is our number 2 industry. Okay, that's the first part, which is federal funding 101. Now let's talk about where Congress comes into the picture. So one confusion that people have sometimes, because it's different from the state and the county to some extent, is that we have what we call authorizing legislation and appropriations. And these are 2 separate functions in Congress. In Congress, an authorizing legislation is the underlying legislation that sets the policy and authorizes the program and authorizes the spending. Does not mean that the spending will occur. It does not mean that the spending will occur. The second step is appropriations. The spending will occur. And these are 2 separate functions. They're handled by separate committees. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. You want your what we call subject matter committees, which are doing the authorizing, to kind of figure out what we should actually try to work on and what we should authorize, what we should, the parameters of the programs. But you want to centralize the spending in one committee, because otherwise things get away if everybody starts fighting with each other. And so when we talk about, sometimes I hear people say, well, you know, why aren't we getting so much money out of this federal program that's authorized at, you know, $30 million? And the reason is because we authorized it at 30 million, but we may not have appropriated it. We can go up to the 30 million, but it doesn't mean we went there. In fact, some programs are out there that are authorized and don't get any money for whatever reason. So always think about that, authorizing versus appropriations. But this is where the action is, this is where the money comes, and this is where I play. House Appropriations Committee, 50 plus members now. So roughly 1/10 of the U.S. House. Another key point here, the federal administration, the executive branch, the president, does not authorize or appropriate spending. They implement the directions of Congress. Sometimes people say, well, the president spent this and the president spent that. And, you know, in my branch of government, the legislative branch, we're a little jealous of that. You know, we get a little insulted because it's our job under the Constitution to authorize these programs with the president's, you know, consent. He has to sign the law, she has to sign the law. But the appropriations come out of the House and the Senate as a law. The president does have to sign them, but then the president implements them from directing the spending out on Congress's direction. Also, the other thing to realize and to note is that the appropriations process starts in the House Committee on Appropriations by law and practice. So we initiate every year the appropriations process. We're the oldest committee in Congress. We date back to the first years of Congress, 1789. And we operate through 12 subcommittees. So we split up our responsibilities into subcommittees because 50 members acting at large doesn't give specialty in each of the areas. Another busy slide that describes the various subcommittees. Agriculture over here, which is self-explanatory, about 25 billion. Energy and water, 54 billion. Labor, health, and human services, 227 billion. But the largest one is defense at close to $800 billion. And I just got appointed to this subcommittee, so this is a really good appointment for us. Homeland Security at 87 billion. This is about all of our, you know, anything you can think of that has to do with actual Homeland Security, to include, by the way, the Coast Guard. I just got appointed to this subcommittee. I'm so excited to work on this subcommittee. Military construction, I spent 4 years on this subcommittee at 325 billion. But each of us is appointed to 2 to 3 of these subcommittees, usually 2. So you get into a specialty situation. The Defense Subcommittee at this point has, I think we ended up at 15 members of the Defense Subcommittee. Homeland Security has 10. So we're responsible for that part of our federal budget. Overview, I'm going to kind of summarize this. And this is in the normal process. there is a budget process. Separately from the actual appropriations, we are supposed to be setting a big picture budget every year before we get into appropriations. We're supposed to be saying, okay, well, this is the big picture, how much you're going to spend, where it's going to come from, how much debt, and these are the parameters for appropriations to work within. Unfortunately, we have been skipping this process and running straight to appropriations, which makes for a pretty disjointed process because you hit appropriations not really knowing what your big picture is going to be, what your real parameters are going to be. They're kind of ad hoc made up on the way, which makes for a very difficult process. So think about this as one process that we should do. This is the process that we actually do, which is the appropriations committees get together and start to hash out the federal budget and pass our bills. And then hopefully they pass Congress and they're sent to the White House and the president passes them. This kind of describes the process. This is January and February using FY 2024. So I'm working on FY 2024 right now. We're already almost POW with February. Note that I've been working on FY 2024 for about 6 to 9 months already. We're way ahead of this game, even though we didn't pass FY 2023 until the end of December. In our office, we were already working on FY 2024 because if you don't do that, you're going to get overwhelmed at the end. President has his proposal to Congress, which is not mandatory. He sends it over, but it's just kind of, that's what he wants to do. This is an important deadline, so please note this right now, March 17th. Deadline for appropriations requests to my office, March 17th. And that's to give me time to process before my own deadline, which is not yet set, but it's going to be somewhere around early April. So I need to be very conscious of this time frame right here. This is very intense time for my office right in here because every year we have, we submit appropriations requests in 12 separate bills. We usually put in about 50 to 75 requests per bill. We have to vet every single one of them. We have to make sure that it's tight. It's my credibility on the line with the Appropriations Committee, and that's how I'm able to get my work done. April 15th is a congressional budget resolution deadline. I don't know whether we're going to do that this year, so that's aspirational. Somewhere around May, my committee starts up in earnest, and it starts to crunch bills out in markup, which means we sit in a room for days for each of these subcommittees, and then we do it again for the full committee for each of those subcommittee bills. And we go through amendments, we go through a discussion, so that we can bring them to the floor of the House somewhere around June. That's our target. By the way, the Senate has to do everything too, because we can't just do it on our own. We have to agree with the Senate, and we're aiming for a September deadline, right? September 30th. So hopefully by July we're in conference with the Senate and we pass everything by September, but if we don't pass it, it slides, and this is when the bills passed last year. So we've got, in my mind, I have 7 months until September 30th, but I really only have 2 to 3 months to really have most of my influence on this process. Okay, let's get into how to interact with my office on appropriations requests. Now, the first thing I want to say is everything is on case.house.gov. So this is straight off of my page. You just go to case.house.gov, and this is the screenshot of that. So hopefully that will help you along. There's a couple of ways to ask for my help in terms of appropriations. 3 ways to be specific. Programmatic requests. These are requests for money from programs of the federal government. So pretty straightforward. You want money for invasive species. What is the program? How do we get the money out of that program to Hawaii? So that they ask for funding. Usually what I'm trying to do here is to increase the overall amount in that program because if I can increase the overall amount in that program, chances are it will help Hawaii. I cannot earmark specifically to that program with some exceptions. So the idea that I could go in and say, please designate $17 million for Hawaii invasive species, That's the old days. That's the Senator Inouye time, right? That was how he was able to do so well, because they had direct, large earmarking in those days, which got abused and then got canceled for 10 years, and we have it back a little bit now. But most of them have to be larger requests. So please, in this particular case, so for example, sometimes it's pretty obvious, like the Native Hawaiian healthcare program. Now, if I ask for an increase in money for the Native Hawaiian healthcare program, it's probably not going to go to Idaho. It's probably going to come to Hawaii. I'm not earmarking, but indirectly, it is what I'm doing. So I'm trying to find the programs that have a disproportionate impact on Hawaii, and then increase the funding or support those particular programs. This is just an example of something I did. We increased funding for the Minority Business Development Agency, which funds our small business, minority business efforts, and I know darn well that if I increase that, it's going to come to Hawaii. Language requests. These are requests for direction or instruction or suggestion from the Appropriations Committee adopted by Congress to the agencies. So they are not direct requests for funding, but they can lead to increased funding. And they're also a good opportunity for me to question the federal agencies on why they're doing something. Now, I play this game short-term, mid-term, long-term. Sometimes I want an answer right away that'll help me with my funding, and sometimes I'm trying to set something up for future years. And so we've had some examples of this, for example, in our healthcare delivery, where we've had persistent problems with the federal government in an area. I'm on appropriations. If I ask the question through the appropriations process, the fact is I'm much more likely to get an answer from the federal agencies than if I wasn't on that appropriations and I didn't do it in the appropriations. Why? Because they know I'm an appropriator. So it's not, I'm being overly simplistic, but those are the realities of the situation. In this particular case, I asked for, and I can also direct funding or strongly suggest directed funding, which is technically not an earmark. But in this particular case, I told them that the funding was being provided for the State of the Birds program, which is our effort to combat the rapid diminution of our bird species, our indigenous, or endemic, I should say, bird species. So don't just think about money, think about what's my problems with the federal government, how can I actually advance the resolution of those problems that might lead to funding. Okay, CPFs, these are our modern day earmarks. We don't call them earmarks because earmark is a bad word, but they are earmarks. They are directed funding from me, from our Appropriations Committee for a specific project, and they're highly limited. We just tiptoed into these waters again 2 years ago, and I get, at the last rules, I get 15 of these a year, total of 15. Limited funding, I can't go out and ask for $1 billion for earmarks. So I can't, build the new saddle road over on the Big Island, which is now the Daniel K. Inouye Highway. But I've been able to have some really, really, nice results that are trying to fill a gap that is just not getting handled by any other federal, state, or county, or independent funding, for that matter. Or sometimes you just want to cut through and just get something done right away. So I actually had, and this is actually true of Senator Schatz and Senator Hirono as well, and this is a matter of us coordinating with each other, but I actually had one of the highest rates of success with CPF funding of anybody in Congress. And that happened because we were very tailored on it, and because we worked with you very hard to get every single result or request exactly right, so it was credible, so that it could be accepted, so there was no question. I have to personally sign for the veracity of any CPF request. And so this is an important area for us to consider. I've done it for a lot of different projects. I helped the Honolulu Fire Department with a project that they had that was hung up, for example. Thank the fire department for being here. I've helped nonprofits. I helped with a fascinating program in Papakolea that really is an outreach program for youth. And there's good examples of this. There are parameters that I have to follow. And by the way, given that we're in a new majority, Now, the Republican majority is modifying these rules, so as we speak. So I don't exactly know where that's going to end up, but I may not be able to do some of the stuff I used to do. How to submit your appropriations request? Well, number one, again, contact my staff and as to how to get through the process. But you can help us by working it up as well as you possibly can. See my website. All of this is on my website. In fact, I think this is off my website. First, get your information together. Give some thought to exactly what you want from a funding perspective. If you can, identify a federal program from which you want to get that funding, because we need to match the request to a program. What agency, what department, if we have a budget, which is probably not going to be relevant, what does the budget actually say about that? And that's our budget. But if it's the president's budget, it would help to know that the president also supports it. We can get that information real fast, but you guys have access to it too. What kind of request is it? Is it a programmatic request, funding request? Is it a language request where you want a direction or an information request or a suggestion? Or is it straight up community project funding? Is it a specific project that can be funded specifically to a purpose? These are obviously highly preferred if we can figure them out, because there's, you have to, that's it. Once it passes, it's done. The federal government has to implement it. Reasonable funding amount, I have to be realistic. It's my credibility. I'm successful because of that. Short summary, draft the bill or report language if it's needed, mainly for language requests. Each of us has an online form for submitting an appropriations request, and please use that form, because that form feeds into the form that I have to use when I submit to the Appropriations Committee. So I know this is a lot to absorb, especially if this is your first time, but the bottom line is go to my website, see what's there, come back to my staff, talk about it generally, give us as much information, and we will give you the guidance needed. Okay, that was about appropriations directly out of Congress, right? But there's a whole nother world out there, which is money that Congress has already appropriated to programs, but that the federal executive branch, the administration, is responsible for administering. And we have given them guidance on how to administer, but they've got the con at that point. And my input is to ask them about why are they doing this or that, or to support a particular grant request, or to come down on them if they're not getting the job done. But it's not within my kuleana anymore to actually do it. So these are federal grants. And this is a page directly out of the federal government, which is grants.gov. So grants.gov is how you get into the federal government grants process. There are, in many of the departments and agencies here, people that specialize in this. You're probably in the room. You know that it's, you need to navigate grants. But we have been very successful with grant applications where we have spent the time to analyze what we want, why we want it, and exactly how to go about it and get it. And again, my office is available to help with federal grants. Okay, let's talk a little bit about a distinction in grants, which is a little bit like mandatory versus discretionary spending. Grants come in two ways, competitive and formula grants. Formula grants are pretty automatic, like mandatory spending. They're gonna flow to the state or the county, primarily the state or the county, because these don't really go to nonprofits or to any other entity. These are distributions based on some kind of very automatic criteria. For example, federal transportation funds. How many highway miles do you have? What's the demonstrated usage of your roads? Health. How many people do you actually have in Medicaid? And so it's just automatic pilot. It's going to happen. And my job is to make sure that how it happens is fair and that it is that it is happening. A lot of the transportation projects are formula. That's my best example from a formula funding. Here's where the action is. competitive grants. These are grants that are available, but not on a formula basis. But you got to go out and compete for them. You got to say, well, why should I get this money? And people make decisions, and there are winners and there are people that don't get them. And so this is where we are, we have a mixed result. And there's a number of reasons for it. It's a complicated process. It is competitive. Sometimes we're just not as good as other people in terms of applying for them. But we are increasingly very good at it. And so I'm encouraged by the trend, and I want to keep this one going. Sometimes people ask me, well, what's a good example of a shop that does competitive grants? Well, the University of Hawaii is very, very good now at competitive grant applications and funding. They just had a record federal funding year, which was partly just our normal appropriations efforts for them, but it was partly because they're just a lot better at competitive grants now. The city and county of Honolulu, two or 3 years ago, was it, actually set up a shop to chase competitive grants collectively. The state, to be honest, is still not quite as coordinated on it. Some departments are better than others, but everybody can stand to understand what kind of competitive grants are out there and to go chase them through the grant criteria. And again, we work very hard to help you on that because we want you to succeed on it. And it's especially important when I get to the big picture bills that I want to close on. This federal grant cycle, there's a kind of a pre-award, award, and post-award period. Pre-award is when the competitive grant opportunity is sent out to people. So here's what is available. The Department of Health and Human Services is soliciting applications for competitive grants to implement the XXYY law. X amount of funding is going to be available, and these are the criteria to apply for that funding. So that's the pre-award period. That's on your side, grants.gov. The award period, they have to decide who won and who didn't. And the post-award period, which is really important because track record and credibility is really critical for these federal agencies. They don't want to be accused of wasting the money. We can help you on grants. We help you identify grant opportunities. I regularly send out letters or some other distribution saying, hey, what about this grant opportunity? But I can't follow in my office every single grant opportunity that's happening in the federal administration. So it's primarily on you to be watching grants.gov and to coordinate efforts to see what might be available. I co-host workshops with federal grant-making agencies. I co-host a workshop on how to recognize and apply grants. I'll probably do it later this year. I do it every 1 or 2 years. And then finally, we write letters of support because we want you to succeed. And as long as I agree with what you're trying to do, I'm going to weigh in on it. This is just an example of a letter to the Department of the Interior, some grant that somebody applied for, and I wanted them to succeed, so we weighed in. I can't make them do this, but I can certainly weigh in on why I think it's important. Okay, last, landmark funding opportunities that are staring us in the face. Last Congress, we passed 2 pieces of legislation that are generational. The first was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which we usually call just IIJA. We call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. You may have remembered it was the subject of some controversy. But this is over about 1.2 trillion investment in our nation's infrastructure. So roads, bridges, broadband. But think about it a lot broader than that, because if you're only going to focus on kind of roads and bridges, you're going to miss the point of things like, well, broadband is an obvious one. We've been spending a lot of time trying to make sure that that is funded. We expect, if we do this right, $2 billion, maybe more, to Hawaii over 5 years to help us out. This is not going to reoccur, so we need to track this and get this. A lot of this is programmatic funding, but some of it is competitive, and that's where we need to be working. The Inflation Reduction Act, kind of similar. 2 separate bills. This one is particularly focused on the climate change and sustainable energy to transfer us off of fossil fuels, and of course we're doing that here. And there's a whole bunch of areas in there that help us with that. But what I'm focused on is about $500 billion in new spending that is available to state and counties, and in some cases nonprofits and other organizations, mostly on a competitive basis. So this is not necessarily programmatic funding to implement the Inflation Reduction Act. I just posted on my website yesterday well, I think I have a slide of this. Yeah, take advantage of the moment. This is back to the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is already starting to flow into Hawaii. We've seen announced funding of closing in on $1 billion for Hawaii on the IIJA. So we expect another $1 billion plus over the next couple of years. Again, most of that has been programmatic to date. We've had some competitive success, but the competitive stuff is still out there. So highways, water pollution, weatherization, runways. This is a pretty good opportunity to try to fix our airports. Lead pipe, which is an issue here, EV charging infrastructure, internet, which is really critical. We've had some funding already on clean school buses. This is from my website. I just posted this on the IRA. I'm actively tracking about 104 programs through which this IIJ funding is going to flow. This is the spreadsheet of my tracking, which is public and on my website, and which I'm going to update. We are trying to assure that for each of these 104 programs, somebody is tracking it here in Hawaii. That's our goal. Like, somebody should be watching each of these 104 programs for opportunities from the IRA. Sometimes they're grants, loans, they could be direct federal spending. Case.house.gov, but also the White House has a very good tracking as well on this. And by the way, we're trying for both of these bills to have members of the cabinet, assistant secretaries come out to spend time with us to highlight these a little bit more, because the moment is now for these. For example, just today, the Environmental Protection Agency announced over $17 million for clean water programs to Hawaii under the IIJA for FY 2023. That's over and above other funding that is available through the federal government, or obviously what state and county governments are doing. So bottom line, again, once in a generation opportunity that is in addition to the normal appropriations process. Okay, so that's my quick presentation, or maybe not so quick. We talked about the federal budget overall, revenues versus expenses, debts and deficits, and how that is a huge number and also a problem in terms of the increasing debt and deficit situation of our country. So this is a pretty fluid situation. As you know, many people in Congress are asking for spending to be substantially reduced. I'm not one of them, but we can't go spending at this increased level, at least without additional revenues. We cannot continue to jack the debt like this and the deficits. So I'm in that camp. I'll be pretty active. I'll probably be a troublemaker on it and show up in the news and people will get mad at me, but we're trying to make sure that we can do this for more than just the next couple of years. Congressional appropriations, I talked about where we enter into the picture. I talked about where we are in this particular cycle. I talked about how you can work with us to submit appropriations requests. And within this, we also talked about the grant process, which is not a direct relationship with my office, but where we can actually help. And then I talked about the two bills that we are very much focused on. But again, some of the bottom lines, please visit my website to submit appropriations requests, get the information. Also, I run a regular e-newsletter, so please sign up for my e-newsletter. Contact us for specific help. We have done that repeatedly over the last 4 years, and we're going to continue. It's been very, very helpful to have a solid partnership with people back home, because again, I can't do this alone, and you know, you can do it alone, but it really helps to help us help you. And then follow funding updates and guidance as it comes in from the feds. How to reach me, again, this is of my website. DC office, if you're in DC, come and see us. Honolulu office, I spend a third of my time home, so I can usually come and visit you personally, or you can come and visit me, or you can visit me in DC. But we can do everything remotely nowadays, email, website. Questions dealing with Hawaii specifically, Jackie Conant, Deputy Chief of Staff, is the easiest way into my office. And then for appropriations and general funding questions, Kanan here is my go-to. That's it. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to being your partners on this. I hope you got some useful information out of this.